In the spring of 1912, RMS Titanic slipped beneath the ocean waves. Her disappearance is riddled with rumor and speculation. The truth has never been completely known. What exactly happened on that terrible night to cause the death of 1,523 men, women, and children? Titanic took many secrets to her final resting place. Now, an unprecedented scientific expedition pieces together Titanic's final hours. Clue by clue, evidence is being gathered. Piece by piece, a story is beginning to unfold. New discoveries are shattering age-old myths. Science is taking us back in time to witness the sinking of the unsinkable Titanic. The French research vessel Nadir is en route to an historic spot some 400 miles off the coast of North America. Her crew is plotting a course to one of the most notorious points in the North Atlantic. The site of the Titanic disaster. The Nadir is joined by another French vessel, Ocean Voyager. On board, an elite team of scientists and engineers, each exploring a phase of the Titanic disaster. Paul Mathias is a leader in underwater imaging technology. He will try to discover the iceberg damage that doomed Titanic. Naval architect Bill Garsky believes clues to the disaster can be found in Titanic steel. Did Titanic steel shatter like glass during the sinking? David Livingstone works for the company that actually built Titanic. He wants to know why she sank so quickly and why she broke in two. Roy Collymore is the team biologist. He wonders if a community of deep-sea organisms is sealing Titanic's ultimate fate. Charles Haas and Jack Eaton are Titanic historians. They'll provide historical context to this investigation. Together, this team will show why a brush with an iceberg proved fatal to a ship built to endure such hazards. A simple buoy and flag mark one boundary of the wreck site. It was in these very waters that the Titanic drama began some 85 years ago. Exploring the Titanic has been likened to conducting a technological orchestra with engineers, divers, and scientists. Great care is taken to prepare gear for the first dive. On the bridge of the nadir, the captain guides the ship over the wreck site. Directly below lie the remains of the greatest sunken ship of all time. The Titanic tragedy is among the most infamous maritime disasters in history. On her maiden voyage to New York City, she endured a series of events which saw her demise. A glancing blow with an iceberg led to catastrophe. Today, Titanic lies buried in more than 12,000 feet of water. Her bow and stern are separated by nearly a half a mile. The forces that caused this destruction must have been awesome, but the facts of that night have remained elusive, mysterious.
The Titanic is the subject of a great many myths and a great many bits of misinformation. That's why I think this expedition is so significant, because science is giving us the tool to eliminate some of this misinformation and tell what really did happen that night.
Paul Mathias is the first to explore the wreck site. His underwater imaging technology is being loaded onto a state-of-the-art submersible, Natil. This yellow submarine is one of a handful in the world that can take humans down 12,000 feet to the site of Titanic. Mathias will try to uncover the iceberg damage. Legend has it that the iceberg tore a gaping wound into Titanic's side. But nobody knows for sure.
After the Titanic hit the iceberg, there was enough damage to sink her. Exactly what damage occurred to the hull is not known with certainty. The reason is a major part of the front of the bow of the boat is under the mud. And it's been a mystery for 80 years. Today we're going to try to solve that by looking beneath the mud using a seismic profiler, much like a physician might use an ultrasound.
Like a medical ultrasound, this sonar will create images by sending and receiving acoustic signals. Mathias hopes his signal will penetrate the mud, enabling him to see the wound in Titanic's side. Revealing this damage is the first step in reconstructing the disaster. Natil's robotic arms will be used to position the sonar near the mud that hides the damage. Inside the tight confines of Natil, there's room for 3 divers and a deep-sea lab.
This is the first time this kind of approach has been used to image a hull that's buried beneath the mud. I think this is overall going to give us a lot more information about the Titanic than we've ever had before.
The investigation of Titanic is extremely dangerous. More than 5,000 pounds of pressure every square inch will be exerted on the shell of Natil. one tiny crack in the titanium steel would cause Natil to instantly implode. The waters themselves can be very hostile. Freezing temperatures and strong currents add danger to every dive. In the sea, divers free Natil from her lines. In the control room of Nadir, the crew monitors the sub's progress using state-of-the-art visioning software. But if the sub gets in trouble, there's little that can be done from Nadir. For nearly an hour and a half, Natil will free fall on her way to Titanic. Titanic was the pride of Belfast, Northern Ireland, towering over the city where she was built. She was nearly 175 feet tall and 900 feet long. In her day, she was the largest moving object ever built. Her engines were 4 stories high. Each of her 3 propellers were larger than a house. Titanic's hull was comprised of more than 2,000 1-inch thick steel plates, held together by some 3 million rivets.
In many ways, the Titanic set a new standard in terms of her design, especially in the area of safety. There were the latest watertight doors, which were held in place by a magnetic latch, and simply by moving a switch, all of these watertight doors could be closed just by gravity, so that even if power failed, they could be sealed.
Titanic was designed to sustain some damage. The popular press dubbed her invincible and even unsinkable. On her maiden voyage, more than 2,000 passengers and crew would board Titanic, all confident they would reach New York safely. Only 705 completed the journey. In the control room on Nadir, the crew monitors Natil's descent to Titanic.
Well, this is Paul Mathias calling from 3,800 meters below the ocean surface. A couple of very tiny portholes up here in the front that we're looking out of that are 6 inches thick.
Depth indicator says we're at 3,767 meters. That's about 2.5 miles straight down from the ship we left about an hour and a half ago. And I'm looking forward to seeing the bottom come up here any second now. We're finally touched down, and I can see a sandy, muddy bottom here. It's lighted by our lights. It would otherwise be pitch black down here.
Out of the darkness, a figure begins to slowly appear.
One of my impressions about seeing the Titanic is the majesty of it. It's a gigantic ship, still upright. And you can see what was once obviously a very impressive, very well equipped sailing vessel.
Before Matthias searches for the iceberg damage, Natil's robotic arms are brought to life. The pilot activates the claws and carefully clutches the sonar. The investigation begins by recording images of visible damage. This information will help Matthias interpret what he finds under the mud.
Coming up on an edge here, an opening in the hull that we can pick up on the video. This is above the mud line. Here we can see into the hull, and at the same time our seismic profiler's starting to show a nice hyperbolic shape. This confirms that we're starting to pick up openings in the hull with this system. Very encouraging.
After collecting these baseline images, the crew moves on to its biggest challenge: to find the holes that sank Titanic. The use of sonar at this depth to peer through the mud has never been attempted. There is no guarantee of success. The survey takes 3 hours. What will Matthias find buried beneath the mud? The story of Titanic's destruction begins 3 days into her maiden voyage. Titanic's captain, E.J. Smith, receives several ice warnings from other ships. Smith alters course further south to avoid the danger, but he still maintains Titanic's fast speed.
I can't imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Captain Smith.
Smith's confidence would soon be dashed. "11:40 Sunday evening. Lookouts high in the crow's nest spot an iceberg looming in the haze. They ring a warning bell 3 times and message the bridge. From the bridge, the Titanic is turned hard to port. But it's too late. Captain Smith dispatches one of the ship's builders, Thomas Andrews, to assess the damage. Andrews moves quickly into the ship's forward compartments for an inspection. What he sees is devastating. Titanic's hull plating has been dangerously pierced by the iceberg. While the ship was designed to survive some flooding, Andrews finds damage in the first 6 compartments. Andrews reports to Captain Smith. The ship has an hour and a half, maybe 2. The great ship Titanic is doomed. Inquiries into the disaster tried desperately to figure out how much damage the iceberg inflicted upon Titanic.
When the investigations into Titanic's loss convened, they were faced with a problem. The one person who could have told them the most about the ship and what had happened that night, Thomas Andrews, was lost.
Even testimony from survivors was riddled with contradictions and inconsistencies.
That's one of the difficulties in trying to determine what happened, is because as you talk to you look at each survivor's testimony, you'll find that each one has a different reaction to what happened.
There was one expert at the inquiry who believed he knew what happened. Naval architect Edward Wilding worked for the shipyard that built Titanic. Wilding proposed the key to understanding the damage could be found in the nature of the flooding. Titanic flooded unevenly in 6 compartments. To Wilding, this meant that each compartment suffered its own unique damage. Wilding also proposed to the investigators that the actual iceberg damage could be very, very small. The press, however, ignored him. Nearly everyone believed that the only thing that could destroy Titanic was a massive gash in her side.
The very well accepted London Graphic had a drawing of the hull showing 15 feet above the keel a big open wound.
This legend of the 300-foot gash has lasted for nearly a century. Matthias and the crew of Natil are retrieved from the icy North Atlantic after 9 hours of investigation. The answer to an old mystery is now within reach. Will they find that Titanic suffered a giant gash, or the equivalent of pinpricks? How large was the damage that led to the ultimate destruction of the ship?
Well, here we're coming in. I'm going to come in.
Matthias and his assistant Stephen Derzenko comb through their data.
Right here, okay, and then right there. See that? Okay, we're just starting to see through the mud.
Oh, wow.
Right here. That's a deformation. That's
Can you
something
pause
buried
that
in
then?
there.
All right, so what do you think that is?
Well, we have 2 small deformations. two small distortions pretty close to each other.
Can we get, I guess, an approximate size on that?
That one's 5 feet, 5 to 6 feet. And boom, look at that. There's another one.
Yeah, it looks like the same thing.
Well, except it's longer. See it? It goes from here to here.
Two more punctures are discovered in Titanic's hull. For the next several hours, Matthias and Derzenko identify the damage to Titanic compartment by compartment. Then a new and startling picture begins to emerge with each piece of evidence. The great ship Titanic was not torn open by a giant gaping wound. Just as Edward Wilding predicted, a series of small holes caused the tragic disaster.
Okay, let's see. We have a small hole here near the bow.
As Matthias plots the cracks in Titanic's hull, he believes much of the damage is only as thin as a human finger.
2553. Maybe right here. And one right next to it here. Okay, then we have a 15-foot hole at 5699. Just here. And 2549. Okay, so that's a 15-footer. It starts there, and it runs back. By being able to use our sonar, look through the mud, we've got some indication of a small hole here near the peak. Two more small holes about 5 to 10 feet, fairly small here, in cargo hold number 1. And we got a larger hole here that extends back. It's on the order of 15 feet or so. And then we're seeing another 32-foot, approximately 32-foot separation that extends back here into cargo hold number 3. And then finally, the biggest hole is back in boiler room number 6. Separation runs all the way across, apparently back across this transverse bulkhead.
The night of the disaster, the iceberg buckled Titanic's plates and popped rivets. Incredibly, these small wounds started a pattern of flooding that led to the demise of the great ship. Matthias shares the news with naval architects Garsky and Livingstone.
Not a continuous sort of zipper or gash, not a long 300-foot type of opening.
Now other questions are being raised. With such a small amount of damage, just how did Titanic sink so quickly? Here, in the very place where Titanic was built, naval architects are unraveling the mystery of why Titanic sank so fast. How did such minor damage cause the unsinkable ship to founder in just over 2 hours? Working many long hours, 2 researchers have recreated the sinking, relying on Edward Wilding's testimony about the flooding.
Right, what have we got?
Hello, John, this is condition.
Naval architects John Bedford and Chris Hackett have created a computer model that uses many of Wilding's calculations. They agree with Wilding that Titanic was not torn wide open, and that the damage totals a mere 12 square feet, the equivalent surface area of an average-sized person.
And I found that the media and the literature on the subject was so full of misleading information that I began to get interested. And the more we looked at it, then the more surprising things that we found.
Their scenario begins at 11:40. Bedford and Hackett calculate that immediately after impact, the water is rushing in at almost 7 tons per second. Titanic was designed to sustain some flooding, but with 6 compartments flooding simultaneously, all safety gear was rendered useless. Just 10 minutes after the collision, most of the damaged compartments are filled to the top.
According to the inquiry report, you've got the mailroom afloat, which brings it up to 24 feet.
Unaware of the danger therein, 5 men dragging mail to higher ground get caught in the intense flooding and drown.
We can then go on another 10 minutes to midnight. The water's risen to G deck through number 1 hatch.
In a mere 20 minutes after impact, passengers walking along the promenade comment that they suddenly feel as if they're walking downhill. By midnight, Bedford and Hackett estimate that the ship had taken on 8,000 tons of water.
Based on the figures after 20 minutes at 12:20.
12:20. 40 minutes after the collision, the bow is only 15 feet away from being submerged. The first 2 lifeboats are launched, but they are not filled. People still cannot comprehend that the ship is going under.
And that's it there. We've still no water at all really in number 4. And everything is flooded now to the waterline except number 5. The bow is submerged.
1 hour after the iceberg strike, all damaged compartments are filled to the waterline. Bedford and Hackett estimate that Titanic has now taken on 25,000 tons of water. Captain Smith knows time is running out. He orders distress rockets to be fired. Radio operators frantically signal for help. All in vain.
Okay, she's still stable, so we can carry on flooding.
At 1:40, 2 hours after impact, the situation turns even more grim. Brave crewmen who've been supplying power to the ship's lights now scramble for their lives. More compartments flood, pulling the bow underwater. The giant stern heaves up into the night sky. In just over 2 hours, Titanic is lost.
We can carry on filling up and we'll see if that's sufficient to sink her. And it is. And away she goes. That's it. So that's 20 past 2. That's her sunk.
More than 1,500 people were still on the ship as she went down. One of the greatest marvels of her time was sent into the blackness of the sea by some 12 square feet of damage.
At the time, she was the biggest. She was the best. She could beat nature. She could go through an ice floe. She could hit an iceberg. She was unsinkable. She was fast. She was big. But she was a pimple on the ocean. Nature could yawn and knock her aside and did.
The Titanic represented a time of great optimism. It was believed that technology reigned supreme over nature. When the great ship set sail, no one was concerned that there were not enough lifeboats on board. But after this incredible disaster, safety philosophy would change forever. Today we know unsinkable ships cannot be built. Designs now focus on keeping vessels afloat just long enough to be abandoned.
Okay, first, the signal abandon or distress signal.
Drills are mandatory and help ensure quick evacuation.
Get your gear and meet down on the next floor where all the safety rafts are.
Modern ships also carry enough lifeboats for all on board. This was not the case with Titanic.
Anyway, since the Titanic, there is enough room in the life raft for everybody.
Survival suits like this one are provided to all passengers. They offer protection against freezing seas. Most of Titanic's casualties did not die from drowning, but rather from exposure to ice-cold water.
Time to win 145.
The deep sea is a new frontier. Few people have traveled to the dangerous depths of 12,000 feet. Prototype submersibles like Natil have opened up other worlds. But despite more than a decade of visits to Titanic, there is still much to learn. To biologist Roy Colomar, Titanic is like another planet, teeming with mysterious microbial life.
That only 5% of the microorganisms on this planet have ever been described or identified. 5%. 95%.
We tend to think of the Earth as a surface. We live on the surface or close to the surface, and the birds fly overhead, the trees grow in the soil, the water laps at the beaches, and we don't realize that there are many biological universes on this planet.
They do not grow on Agar, so we don't see them.
Colomar believes that Titanic is now home to a giant community of microbes.
What we've got to do is find new techniques to find these organisms and get them to grow so that we get a broader picture of the organisms that are out there. The Titanic is one side.
He believes the organisms are actually eating Titanic.
Two layers of film here.
Colomar is building biological traps to capture and identify the bacteria that reside on the wreck.
Closely through the interfacing.
A strip of 35mm film is the bait. Film is made with gelatin, which is food for bacteria.
See, already you're doing it much better. No.
The bottom of the tube is baited with food that's rich in iron.
And what they're going to do is they're going to mine the film. They're going to try and take the film, the gelatin off, and so they're going to tunnel, they're going to etch it away, and then we're going to hopefully see some beautiful patterns. Because science isn't just science, it's also art. So what we do is we now put this down.
Colomar hopes to collect bacteria that prefer the iron.
So what we've got...
As these bacteria remove the iron from Titanic, they build these elaborate rust-like structures dubbed rusticles. Colomar believes that the iron-consuming bacteria are the main culprits devouring Titanic.
The ship is starting to disintegrate. And is that disintegration because the rusticles are sucking more and more iron out of the steel, and now the ship cannot support itself, so gradually she's going to go in. Which means the integrity, the structure of the ship, one day will collapse.
What Colomar hopes to do is determine how much of the Titanic has been eaten by the microbe-infested rusticles.
What's frustrating me is, how fast are they growing? How fast are they extracting the iron from the plates of the Titanic? How long will the Titanic last?
As Colomar prepares to gauge the ultimate fate of Titanic, naval architects David Livingstone and Bill Garski look back to the night of the disaster.
Kilometers away. And we took it right.
Now that they know the true iceberg damage and the pattern of flooding, they are beginning to grapple with one more puzzling mystery.
Now,
How did Titanic break into pieces on calm seas?
This is a really jumbled mass of twisted metal, pipe, cable, wires. You name it, it's there, and it's all crushed up together. It's not
unbelievable.
It's not a very inviting place at all.
It's almost like a giant just ripped it apart. I mean, it looks that way.
When the revelation came that the ship was broken in two, it was absolutely astounding to us because of the weight, the credence that we had given the historical reports, and in particular the two investigations that had found that the ship had sank largely intact.
In testimony, all the surviving officers said Titanic sank intact. Others saw the ship break into pieces. Why does history offer such a puzzling account filled with inconsistencies?
There are almost as many interpretations and depictions of the breakup as there are people who gave the testimony.
Survivor Jack Thayer had a sketch made and reproduced on the front page of the Philadelphia Bulletin that clearly shows the ship breaking at the surface. Other testimony depicts the ship breaking when it was underwater.
The controversy is, did the vessel break at the surface? Did it break on the way down? Or did it break when it got to the ocean bottom?
Once you go up, that's your scariest part in terms of she'll start to sweat.
David Livingstone will be searching the wreck site for clues to the breakup.
It's quickly the A-frame is going to take you back, and once you do that...
Last-minute advice is given by expedition organizers.
Once you're locked into that pin, and they're decided that he's ready...
Never before has a naval architect explored the Titanic.
Besides being a naval architect, I think any engineer would be fascinated whether we will ever know precisely what happened, I doubt that. I think we can make a guess at what might have happened and in the order in which it might happen.
As Livingstone sinks to the Titanic, the crew on board Ocean Voyager prepares some unique equipment to aid in his dive. 4 specially designed underwater light towers will shine a blazing spotlight on the wreck. The towers generate light power equivalent to 35,000 household bulbs. One half-ton of chain will carry the lights to the bottom of the North Atlantic. Giant lift bags will pull the lights back to the surface once the chains are released. At the Titanic, Livingstone's first task is to place the biological experiments of Roy Colomar on the wreckage of the bridge.
So those are some instruments and tests that we have to place, and it's suggested that they're placed on the bridge.
That's the good. Okay.
But at an area where there should be a lot of corrosion, so that the scientists can see what is happening and what sort of interactions there are.
The experiments will remain here for several days in order to give the bacteria time to gorge on the bait inside. Livingstone slowly moves from the bow to the stern. At the stern, the crew uses Natil's robotic arm to drag the deep sea light towers into position.
We have just moved away a little bit, and we have asked the command to turn on exterior lights to the submarine. Ah, this is beautiful. Yeah. Very, very powerful lights. This is the first time. Now I can see this engine.
A veil of darkness is removed, and Titanic's massive 4-story engines are revealed. The rubble surrounding the engines is all that remains of the stern's once great decks. Livingstone begins to inspect the jagged edges and confusing shadows for clues to the breakup. To his trained eye, the engines seem to have snapped in half.
The port engine, the fact that one of the cylinders is broken off indicates some of the very immense forces that were acting on the hull at that time. The engine itself is a massive structure. Both engines together weighed some 2,600 tons. But the fact that such a big piece of engine has just disappeared, and quite cleanly, indicates some of the forces that were at work during the sinking.
It appears to Livingstone that Titanic broke here, between two of the engines. But he still doesn't know how or why she broke. Nearly 2.5 hours after the collision, as the last of the lifeboats are being lowered, forcers are building to tear Titanic to pieces. Second Officer Charles Lightoller is a witness to the beginning of the end.
Just then, the ship took a slight but definite plunge. Those that didn't disappear underwater right away instinctively started to climb toward the stern, which was rising steadily out of the water. I knew only too well the utter futility of struggling towards the stern. There was only one thing to do. Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body.
As Lightoller and others struggle for their lives, Titanic comes closer to total destruction. From the icy seas, Lightoller describes an astonishing drama.
The bow of the ship was now rapidly going down, and the stern rising higher and higher out of the water. The terrific strain of bringing the after end of that huge hull out of the water opened the expansion joint near number 1 funnel, causing the funnel to fall.